Thank you very much for sticking around. It's a sign that I didn't drive you completely out of the building, and that's good. Our second presenter today is Dr. S. Michael Pavelec. He holds a doctorate from The Ohio State University.
Go Bucks.
He's the author of 5 books, and he's got 2 more underway. One on the air power campaign over Gallipoli during World War I, and one is a textbook on U.S. military history from 1500 to the present. Today he's going to talk to us about the future of warfare. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Pavelec.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks, PJ. He's being modest. We're writing it together, the last one, U.S. military history. I'm hoping I can project well enough. Everybody, okay. This is going to be highly theoretical. I hope to offer more questions than answer anything. But what we talk about at ACSC a lot, Air War College, Air University, and Paul and I sit around and drink beer and talk about is we speculate about where war is going. So I have to set some fundamental boundaries here. I got to put on some bookends and do some definitions as well. But let's get into it, and I'll see what I can convince you of or dissuade you of in the next 30 minutes or so. Today, war, as it's broadly defined, is all over the globe. Okay, you read about it in the newspaper, you read about it everywhere, you think about it, you see it on TV. You guys have to work on this kind of thing, and we are all concerned about what's going on. So, I mean, this is a good news story and it's a bad news story. The bad news is there's lots of war. The good news is job security. We all know about the domains. I'm not going to go over this a lot and stick with it. The concepts are that there are a number of military domains where war is happening. Some of them are independent, some of them are, most of them are interconnected. This is a graphic I pulled straight off the internet from STRATCOM that says this is what we're looking at and how all these things are working together. Can war in the 21st century overlap? I think the obvious answer is yes. Can it be independent in any one of these? Well, that's where it gets more interesting. And we start thinking about what components war is, what makes up war. The American force structure right now is based on this concept of strength and technology. And Paul was talking a little bit about it, but this is something that we consider when we're talking about war and the future of war. Is the United States has these fantastic legacy systems, what I call legacy systems, airplanes, aircraft carriers, boots on the ground, submarines, missiles, what you guys are dealing with every day. Where are we deficient? What are we missing? Where are our adversaries opening up avenues, what Paul was just talking about a little bit, and taking advantage of places and things that we are not thinking about? So what is quintessential war for the 21st century? Let's talk about strategy for just a second. That comes down to targeting. If you're a Clausewitzian, you think about this side of it. Conventional warfare, targeting governments and militaries. You take care of the military. Clausewitz tells us during the Napoleonic period, you take care of the military and the government will fall and you will win. If you're more Sun Tzu or Mao, you're on the other side. Irregular warfare. Maybe it's the population that's important, the will of the people, the concepts, the message. How is it that you get from fighting a war or having a conflict to winning? Well, now we got to start with how do you define war and winning? So here's some definitions. This is my definition, if I may be so bold. You guys brought me out, so I guess I can. In my last book, War and Warfare Since 1945, I played with it a little bit. The publisher said have fun with it. My first and last chapters are highly theoretical. But I set out my argument with these definitions, first couple of sentences literally in the book. War is a violent struggle between groups for political ends. If you can accept that, that's where I'm taking this argument from. This is where I'm going to start. So for political ends. But the violent struggle component is still important to me, although that might be changing, and I'll get into that in a little bit more. Paul touched on it very briefly, but I'll pick that up again in just a second. Warfare is the conduct of war in its many forms. So what you have with war in the 21st century into the near future, into the far future, is a contextually driven concept The context will matter. The culturally dependent component is also important. Different wars will be fought differently for different reasons depending on who is fighting. The culture of Russia, for example, is different than the culture of China. So there's cultural components. It'll be ideologically determined. And this one's fantastic and really fascinating concept and topic, where if you have somebody who is fighting for political reasons, it may be easier to dissuade them from their politics than if they're fighting for religious reasons. And we can go into that in Q&A, I think. The Soviet Union collapsed. Their politics and their economic systems did not work. We won the Cold War. I'll use air quotes a little bit today, talking about the future. We convinced them through low-grade conflict that their politics and their economics did not work. And most of them have adopted a very strange system of capitalism today. Can we convince the ideologically driven ISIS that their ideology is bankrupt? There's the ideological component. In the past, war was geographically dependent, confined. I put a question mark. Is that still true? Especially when we talk about air power, when we talk about space, when we talk about cyber. Is it geographically confined in the 21st century? Probably not. What about politically motivated? How does politics play a role in war? And then what about technologically constrained? Paul talked about, first Paul, I'm the mic sandwiched between two Pauls. First Paul talked about technologically constrained and the technological changes we're facing into the near future. I work a lot with technology, it's fascinating, and Paul and I both agree that technology has the opportunity and the potential to change both war and warfare into the near future. So how do you win? Mandatory Clausewitz quote. Well, first off, you don't make war into something that it's not. And through history, through our research and writing, Paul and I I'll speak for myself. I'll stop you bringing you into the conversation. I would argue that the United States tends to try to make wars into what we like to fight. In the past, that has worked. Into the future, it may not. And that's something to think about. Can we force war to become what we want to fight and make other people do what we want to do based on legacy systems, methods, and the way that we think war should be? I will argue today, by the end of this, that we need to start thinking about war very differently and the concept of victory very differently. So, war in the near future. Yogi Berra. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. That was supposed to get a laugh. I guess it didn't. Yogi Berra, famous baseball player? Okay, never mind. Lawrence Friedman has taken a hack at this with his book, The Future of War. He didn't write about the future of war necessarily, but he wrote about what people in the past have thought the future of war would be. And theorists and military strategists from the past and what they thought the next war would look like in a historical recollection. It's a fascinating book. We use it fairly extensively at the academic level, at the faculty level at ACSC. It's an interesting way to think about what the future of war will look like and how often people get it right and how often people get it wrong. We, academics, military minds, analysts, politicians, tend to get it wrong more often than we tend to get it right. But we would still argue, especially at ACSC, to continue to think about what war will look like because it's important to be thinking about it all the time. You practice sports so that you're good on Sunday for NFL. You practice thinking about war so that when it comes, you're at least mentally agile enough to be able to accept what's just about to happen, even if you have to change the way you do it. So it's a good attempt. It was a fascinating book, by the way. If you haven't read it, you probably should. But it's an idea of how militaries in the past have dealt with what the future of war looked like in their present. And it's a really good analysis of how people get it right and get it wrong. So what is the spectrum of conflict? You are all in this building, mostly on this end of the graph, thinking about, oh, this is from the back. Usually I can use my finger pointer. The existential threat to the United States of America is probably relatively not likely. This end of the spectrum, irritant military conflict, sub-military conflict, non-military conflict, hybrid war, gray zones, all the catchphrases that we're using now, is probably very likely. And that was from the map. You can see that in the map on the first slide, where you have lots of conflict around the world. Whether we call it war or not is irrelevant. It's competition, it's killing and dying between different groups. That is going to continue. So again, good news, bad news situation. The bad news is it's going to be with us forever. The good news is job security for people like you and me, in uniform, out of uniform, civilian, academics, politicians. This is a thing that we can continue to think about on a regular basis because we have to. So what's the importance of what I'm trying to convey here? The United States is strong in specific areas. We have a great nuclear arsenal. We have a great legacy military. We have the most powerful military in the world in history. We are strong. How do you use that strength against an enemy? Clausewitz tells us you leverage your strength versus your enemy's strength. You crush their armies, you invade their capitals, you force them to capitulate. Worked for Clausewitz, worked for the Prussians and the English during the Napoleonic era. Worked in the Second World War for the United States and the Soviets and the British, the Allies. Worked in the Second World War against the Japanese. We crushed in the German case. I'm just about to lecture this in a couple of weeks in ACSC. We crushed the German military. The Soviets invade, take over, and destroy Berlin. Hitler shoots himself in the head. The Germans capitulate. Unconditional surrender. Strength on strength. Clausewitzian war. Okay, that's the way we'd like to do it. We would like to face against enemies who wear uniforms, who follow the rules that PJ was talking about, who follow Geneva Conventions, who don't use chemical and biological weapons, hopefully don't use nuclear weapons either. And we face them on a field of battle. We see them, they see us. We use our tanks and our airplanes. We blow them all up, and we win. Iraq 2003, the first 6 weeks. What if they don't fight fair? What if our enemy uses their strength against our weaknesses? Normative ethics, the ethical way to fight wars, the moral way to fight wars, the Geneva Convention way to fight wars. What is the proper relationship between military and political strength and weakness? What is the correct application of force for best effect? What will help you, quote unquote, win? That's the big question. Do we win in Iraq? Depends on when you talk about. Are we winning in the Middle East? Depends on when you're talking about. Are the Russians winning in Ukraine? What's the definition of victory in the 21st century? Which approach is the most effective, efficient, ethical, moral, decisive, beneficial, and lasting? And I can give you theorists for each one of those categories, where you talk about not only how to conduct war, but how to win wars and what happens and what comes after wars are over. Conflict. What happens when you win? What happens if you win? So, some concepts to think about very quickly. American blind spots. Technological revolution. That might even be plural. Technological revolutions now underway. Dr. Springer mentioned robots. I'll talk briefly about cyber, because I'm doing some writing on cyber right now. Does cyber fulfill our concept, our traditional concept of war? Clausewitz says that that violence is a necessary component of war. Does cyber fulfill the violence concept? Do you have to have violence for it to be war? Former Secretary of State and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton was on one of the talk shows last night, and I was just flipping through. But she said the question was Russian meddling in the 2016 election using cyber and media power, was that war? And she said it was cyber war. So she parsed it, didn't say, well, it was an act of war, but she did say it was an act of cyber war, which means nothing. Because is it war or is it not? But do we have to be that binary, especially in the 21st century? How does cyber fit into our current concept of war and our future concept of war? If you can bring down a foreign government using nothing but computers and nobody dies, is it still war? And that's a fascinating question to me. Paul's talked about Stuxnet and Iran. We had a political outcome. We kept them from building nuclear weapons, and we didn't lose any people, nor did they. We broke a bunch of their uranium centrifuges. Is that war? It's a fascinating question. But the revolutions that are underway, the technological revolutions, will change the way that wars are fought in the future. Will it change how victory plays out? Absolutely. And these are things that we have to maintain constant vigilance on. What about social manipulation? This one is fascinating. The latest talk of fake news in the United States. Russian and Chinese interference in our electoral cycle. And all the people on both sides talking about how much the Russians and the Chinese are already manipulating social media into the elections next month. Our election, the machines you actually use to do your voting, and how vulnerable they have proven to be. And because the United States relies so heavily on cyber for everything from getting your gas to using the banking machine to checking your email and Facebook, means that we have a vulnerability. There is a vulnerability there that our adversaries might try, well, they will try to take advantage of because of the overuse, the reliance that we have on these systems. Cyber intrusion, again, the same concept with social manipulation and cyber intrusion. The social manipulation, also the bots on Twitter. I mean, that's fascinating stuff. Financial interference. Whether it's the Dow Jones, if anybody's been watching it, this morning hasn't been a good day. Yesterday was a pretty bad day. To the manipulation of currencies around the world. Once you get off the gold standard, they're more susceptible to manipulation. And so currency manipulation and financial interference. Which brings up the concept of freedom versus security. And I do believe that they're on a spectrum and they're at the opposite ends. A colleague of ours, Everett Dolman, who's brilliant, has this great monologue about freedom versus security. You can have absolute freedom, you can have absolute security. You try to be somewhere in the middle. But in our relatively free American society, where we have freedom of movement, we have freedom of communication, we have freedom of online access and all these sorts of things, means that our society collectively is less secure. The more you try to secure things, the less freedom of action you have. And so where's the focal point, where's the good balance between the freedom that we enjoy and the security that we probably need? This is a great argument and concept. I'll leave it for Q&A. So considerations. When we're thinking about warfighting into the near future or the far future, which methods will be most quote-unquote successful towards victory? I would try to argue in that case. Conventional forces or unconventional forces? The United States has lots on both sides of that argument. We have conventional forces, we have unconventional forces. Which will be employed for most success? And then a couple of questions to think about. Can you fight an unconventional force with a conventional force structure and approach? Well, you can. Is it a good idea? Is it successful? Is it lasting? More questions. How can a conventional force defeat an unconventional force and vice versa? These are thought experiments that we should be conducting on a regular basis to think about what the best path is towards success, victory, however we want to define those things. The ultimate question, although I still have 2 slides left, what should the United States prepare for? The existential threat that is least likely, or the irregular but frequent wars and conflicts that we face? Here at STRATCOM, with deterrence and nuclear weapons, we are still preparing for and guarding ourselves against the existential crisis, a war with China or Russia, which makes sense. Strength leads to deterrence, at least in the deterrence theory. Deterrence works right up until it doesn't, right? But so far, nuclear weapons and this great massive legacy force that we have has proven that other state actors with the same force structure will not fight us, which is a good thing. Don't get me wrong, I don't want that to happen. But does the United States prepare for and continue this legacy of what we have been doing since 1945 with a massive, powerful legacy military and nuclear weapons? Do we keep that up for what's going to be an unlikely war? Do you maintain that strength? Arguably, yes, it's a good idea. The deterrent value alone is worth it, although you can't prove a negative. The Soviets may have never attacked us because, the Russians, not the Soviets for a while, the Russians have never attacked us, possibly because we have a beautiful nuclear arsenal in holes in the ground in Wyoming and Nebraska. I was there last summer. It's very cool. Or is it because of the 64.5 Mustang, which was a gorgeous car, and they just said, we don't want to destroy the United States because they have great muscle cars? What is the deterrent component of the force structure that we have? Should we and do we prepare for the existential but unlikely war? Or do we prepare for the irregular but frequent war? Conflicts around the world over things like resources, oil, water is going to become very important. Land, gold, resources, whatever we're talking about. Conflict, political conflicts, and the hundreds of civil wars since 1945 that I just finished writing about. People are angry on this planet, and they're often fighting over political representation, gender representation, resource procurement, a number of different reasons. You get the class wars of the Russians, the Russian revolutions, the French Revolution back in the 18th century. People fight on a regular basis. If they can't have their voices heard through normal political channels, they turn to violence. Lieutenant Colonel / Dr. Hoffman will talk about that in a little bit. But the second half, the irregular but frequent, is actually what is occurring on a more regular basis. In a resource-constrained environment, we, collectively, the Department of Defense, may have to make the decision of what we focus on. Fortunately, under the current administration and our $713 billion defense budget, we don't have to make those choices right now. We can expand both capabilities. But it may or may not ever, we might not be able to tap into that into the next administration, over the course of the next 20 to 50 years. These are the great questions that we're trying to deal with when we have to start making choices. Is the force structure, and this is sort of a byproduct of that question, is the force structure that we have and the application of how we want to use it the same for both of those cases? And if it isn't, why isn't it? Can you fight both an existential war and an irregular war with the stuff that we have? Because we're trying to. And 16 years in Afghanistan would suggest that it might not be working the way that we want it to. These are great ideas and things to ponder. So here are my recommendations. American and allied necessities, because I did notice a couple of allies in here. Thanks. Mental agility and intelligence. And that's what we do at ACSC and Air War College and Air University and all the other places that all of us have taught and been, and you've probably attended. So the education and the experience. The experience component is incredibly important, where people like you in uniforms go off to the war and you fight bad people and you come back and you give us your experiential knowledge. Clausewitz tells us, I go back to Clausewitz quite a bit, I'm sort of a Clausewitzian. Clausewitz tells us that if you can't have experience, then education usually gets you close, which means history. So as a history professor, I kind of like that. You read about all the past wars, you read about other theorists, you read about what has happened to try to set you up for success in the future. The experience component is vital, but the education component is a good and also necessary component as well. Organizational adaptability and flexibility. Fresh ideas and approaches, and that's why I think we were brought out to sort of infuse some ideas and concepts, maybe even some controversy. But, you know, hey, I'm having a great time. Thanks for bringing me to Omaha. It was 41 degrees this morning, so it was a bit cold. But no, it's fantastic that we were able to come out and talk to you and stimulate a conversation and see if we can get some new ideas going. And even if we leave and you have ideas later on down the road, I'll still take credit. Willingness and acceptability for innovation. And this is a big one for the military, at least something that I will argue on a regular basis. Maybe 12 aircraft carriers is not necessary in the 21st century. I'm not trying to disparage any of my Navy colleagues. Maybe the F-35, okay, we won't go there either. So maybe a main battle tank is not a necessary tool for 21st century conflict. So I just picked on every service to be equal. Adaptability and innovation are important. Paul was talking about one sort of innovation with robots. We're going to have to innovate in cyber. We're going to have to innovate in intelligence and gathering. And Colonel Hoffman will talk about adaptation in the global war on terror. Dedicated brain power, hour power, time, and financial power for experimentation. This was one of the big takeaways from my last book, War and Warfare. Again, research and development and education. You'll go, Mike, you have education on there twice. I said, yeah, because I think it's important and it's job security for me. I teach at ACSC and PME. And I do think it's that important because I bring you out there to Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, and I make you really squirm at the questions that I ask in the classroom because I do try to ask really difficult questions and pose difficult scenarios for people to think through to make them sharper, to make them more intelligent, to make them uncomfortable with the way the world is so that they start to understand how complex it will be. So, mandatory closing Clausewitz quote, always remember, everything in war is very simple, but even the most simple things are very, very difficult. And with that, that is my presentation. If you have any questions immediately, I'll take them. Otherwise, all three of us are going to come up later on for sort of rapid fire. I will take your questions.
The facilitator card, and we want to push. I'm going to get Lieutenant Colonel / Dr. Hoffman up here because this is going to be a great segue into, we've had advancements in technology, advancements in warfare, and then Dr. Hoffman is going to talk about what we have seen on the battlefield and how that's going into the future. So we'll do that, and then we'll do the break just before the roundtable forum, and we'll reconfigure the room, bring up the lights, and people sleeping in the back.
Okay. Thank you.
If you will allow me to...